It's the story of complete chaos. Nobody liked anybody else in the picture. The hours were intolerable. We changed cameramen. We changed directors. We changed casting in midstream. We did all of the worst things that can happen to a picture, out of which, I swear to you, rose the phoenix of this great masterpiece.
Miss Scarlett! Scarlett! But Scarlett. Scarlett. Miss Scarlett. Scarlett.
Scarlett.
Miss Scarlett. Scarlett. What a woman.
This woman is known to the world. Look closely. Do you recognize her? Listen to her story, then condemn her.
Shame? Oh, I'm not ashamed. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's true there were men in my life. I admit it. I made mistakes. I was young. I was stupid. I believed in men and their promises.
Well, now, how about your private life? One may inquire.
One may not inquire.
One may not inquire. Well, thank you very much.
Gone with the Wind is a movie made at the heights of Hollywood's golden age, based on a breakthrough novel written by a first-time author who dedicated 10 years of her life to write it. It's a visual masterpiece that managed to break through the boundaries of time itself. 8 decades later, still being streamed to audiences worldwide, and it remains the highest-grossing movie of all time. It brought on the first British Best Actress nomination and win for its leading lady. The casting process and production were riddled with disaster and even scandal. Actors were lured into accepting roles by promises of divorce, while others were only offered roles if they could produce a marriage certificate, all for a movie with an almost 4 hours runtime made by actors who reportedly couldn't stand each other and 3 different directors. This is the story of Gone with the Wind, a demanding producer who had an alleged drug dependency, the nightmarish environment in which it was produced and thrived. The star of the movie, Vivien Leigh, who was cast to play what is considered to be the most American role of all time, all while being very British. Its other star, the character that we all hate but somehow still love, Scarlett O'Hara, and its other star, Margret Mitchel, the woman who began it all. Disclaimer: I can't talk about this movie without acknowledging its history. Gone with the Wind represents a history which shocks and disgusts me. Its racial depictions are unforgivable, which goes beyond saying. Racism in any shape or form is undeniably wrong across all cultures and even religion, and I can't imagine anyone who could argue with that. That being said, I hope to talk about this film as I saw it the first time, as a child with my mother. My fond memories of this movie come from a place of lack of awareness, I admit, as I had no understanding of American history and the Civil War specifically, and to be honest, till this day my understanding of that part of the movie is limited. And for that reason, I plan to only talk about this film from an artistic point of view, and I will be linking videos down below of creators who have the knowledge and ability to discuss the disturbing aspect of this film in a far better way than I ever could. Finally, I did consider talking about the Civil War and all the issues I noticed as an adult now watching this film, but I honestly just don't feel like it's my place, so please keep in mind that this video was not made to offend anyone. Chapter 1: David Selznick, a man with a vision. Gone with the Wind was produced by American film producer and screenwriter David Selznick, and Selznick is as much as the main character in this story as Scarlett O'Hara herself. Selznick would follow in the steps of his father, Louis J. Selznick, who was a silent film producer and distributor, and he would enter the world of movie making, a world which he would exit only after leaving the strongest of impressions. He began his career by apprenticing in his father's production company, but when the company was eventually dissolved due to financial reasons, David would make his way to Hollywood, where he had a humble beginning as an assistant storyteller at one of Hollywood's largest production companies at the time, MGM. His drive and obvious talent would lead him to acquire jobs at 3 different studios, those being MGM, Paramount, and RKO. During his short time at RKO, Selznick would function as head of production, overseeing all active movie projects. However, after being there for just 15 months, he would hand in his resignation, citing issues over creative control as the reason for his departure, but not before approving a screen test for one balding, middle-aged actor with funny ears. In an office memo at RKO, Selznick wrote, "I feel, in spite of his enormous ears and bad chin line, that his charm is tremendous." This is rumored to be his last act as chief producer at RKO, and that certain balding gentleman with the peculiar ears was none other than Fred Astaire. And this ability to spot would-be stars is what would make David Selznick a star in his own right. This short and kind of funny story would foreshadow the 2 years hunt for the perfect Scarlett, which would encompass David both mentally and financially, and his ability to recognize a star would come in handy once again, but more on that later. Currently, David is frustrated, unfulfilled, and is back at MGM, with his own separate production unit within the company, but his ambition and drive were still limited by working under a massive empire such as MGM, so once again he would leave, despite MGM's desperate efforts to keep him. Selznick would form his own production company, Selznick International, where he can have complete control and ownership of his work, for the first time in his career as a producer. And it's this company that would make history.
He was one of the first of the independent producers. He believed in the dictatorship of the producer. He shares, in common with most younger filmmakers, the belief that there must be one viewpoint controlling the film.
It was always David's picture, never finished until he personally finished it, down to the last cut and the last title and the last optical that was required to make it a completed picture. He did strive harder than anybody I ever knew for perfection.
The production and subsequent success of Gone with the Wind didn't make Selznick International or David Selznick himself well known, as they already were. David was an established producer who was respected among his peers in Hollywood and had successfully launched several movies prior to Gone with the Wind, almost all which were acclaimed. Movies such as The Prisoner of Zenda in 1937, A Star is Born, which was also released in 1937, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Young and Heart, which were both released the following year. And in 1932, the company produced Made for Each Other, Intermezzo, and of course, Gone with the Wind. So while Gone with the Wind wasn't exactly crucial in establishing the career of the talented producer, it did make him a household name, and is still his best known work until this day. And it all started with the production of a novel written by a woman who has never written nor published a novel before, Margret Mitchel's 1936 Gone with the Wind. This novel was making waves before it was even published. Synopses were marketed to several Hollywood producers who might be interested in buying the movie rights of the book, as it was common practice for successful novels. But perhaps because it was Mitchel's first attempt at publishing a novel, and thus no one really had faith in it succeeding, or perhaps it was because Civil War pictures were not only expensive to make, but they tended to perform poorly in the American box office. Either way, Hollywood executives passed on the opportunity. David Selznick was one of them. He had no interest in the novel or the movie version of it. But thanks to his story editor, Catherine K. Brown, who had read the book and essentially fell in love with it, she urged him to buy the rights for it. David, trusting her vision, offered Mitchell $50,000 for the rights just 1 month after the book was published. Of course, 4 months after its publication, the novel would sell millions of copies and would become the best-selling novel of the year. People fell in love with the characters and the world of Gone with the Wind. Moreover, they were eager to see their favorite characters come to life on the big screen, and David Selznick was the only one who owned the legal rights to do so. The overwhelming success of the novel meant two things to the producer. First, it all but guaranteed that the movie would be a box office hit. People from all around the world were discovering the book every day, and they all seemed to love it. This was promising. He didn't have to wonder if he was making a movie that people wanted to see. They clearly did, and he just had to make it. But most importantly, it also meant that he had a lot of pressure on him and his relatively new production company. This was a book which had characters that people connected with and adored at a whole new level, and that must have been a scary thought. If this thing flopped, it could derail his career, or at least damage it to a great extent. You do not want to be the producer that messes up America's favorite book after all. And perhaps because of the pressure or the massive ordeal that filming this movie would eventually become, David resorted to America's favorite new amphetamine at the time, Benzedrine, which is basically the equivalent of today's Adderall. And if David Selznick was a main character in this story, then Benzedrine would at least be a supporting one. Known as the first amphetamine to ever hit the market, it was originally introduced as an inhaler in 1933 by the pharmaceutical company SmithKline & Flinch. The inhaler form of the drug and the subsequent production of oral tablets were both available over the counter, with no need for medical prescription, which made access to them ridiculously easy. Furthermore, they were marketed for a wide variety of conditions, anything from treating nasal congestion to weight loss and coping with symptoms of menopause and even depression. They were even marketed to the army during World War II for their quote-unquote benefits. Written and televised commercials spread like wildfire in the 1930s, marketing the drug for its attractive ability to, well, stimulate you, since it was a stimulant after all.
Something rough got in the stuff and made her neighbors scream. Ow! Who put the Benzedrine in Mrs. Murphy's old teeth?
Amphetamines work directly on the central nervous system to produce a feeling of euphoria, heightened awareness, increased wakefulness, and an overall improvement of the cognitive state, while at the same time reducing reaction time and fatigue. For all those reasons, Benzedrine would later be a controlled drug that is used only under medical observation for conditions such as attention deficiency disorder, and the regulation of it would be strict since it's known to cause addiction in those who use it recreationally. But of course, this was the 1930s and no one knew that yet, and the stressed out and overworked David Selznick was popping it like candy.
Benzedrine had just arrived in the world, so he ate it like popcorn. So sometimes we'd stay in the projection room till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and he's popping the Benzedrine, but we're all falling asleep. He was a fascinating man to work for and the most difficult man I have ever known.
Aware of the pressure that he was facing, the public's eyes following his every step closely, and the massive budget of nearly $4 million, which, adjusted for inflation, would be approximately $66 million in today's currency. Gone with the Wind's budget was only second to Ben-Hur, which had a budget of $4.5 million at the time. Selznick became obsessed with every detail, determined to get every scene right, much to the dismay of pretty much every single person who worked on the set of Gone with the Wind. He wrote and rewrote the script multiple times. Despite having a scriptwriter, he changed scenes, lines, and sets days, sometimes even minutes before filming. He sent hundreds of memos that people dreaded receiving at the end of filming. Every shot had to be up to his standards and, well, just perfect. And his dedication is easy to see when watching the beautiful scenes of the movie. Its cinematography holds up to this day, and it wouldn't be possible without Selznick and probably his Benzedrine dependency. Of course, to everyone else working on the picture who didn't have the luxury of popping stimulants every day, this became really annoying.
Mr. Selznick was just hell on wheels. He had 7 or 8 writers, and in the end, wound up doing the final version himself. He was a very, very capable man, and he let everybody know that he was the boss. He was a very cruel boss, because he didn't hesitate to speak his piece.
Because David used to call me between 2 and 3 in the morning, often, to find out whether or not I could change the aspect of the scene.
In his desire for what he hoped would be almost perfection, he made life very miserable for everybody else. The hours, the working hours, the perfection. There were 5,500 costume sketches made for that film.
The hardest thing was to keep up with David Selznick and his change that he did day and night. Sometimes I had to rebuild entire sets.
He was considered a nuisance because nothing ever pleased him.
Are picking cotton in the fields. And if you please, for about a week, while they were waiting for the right kind of a sunrise, we were picked up at home, 3 o'clock in the morning, and driven about 40 miles out into the country, where David Selznick had caused to be in various stages of growth these cotton fields. And while we were waiting for the sunrise, he had left instructions that Evelyn Keyes and I were to busy ourselves picking cotton. And the two of us were there. We were like idiots before daybreak, actually picking cotton. We were exhausted by the time. I said, why is he making us do this? And he said, because Mr. Selznick wants you to look dirty, tired. He wants your hands to be scratched up with thorny things. And by the time they got the right sunrise, we were the most bedraggled-looking, flea-bitten, scratched young women you could ever imagine. But he was that attentive to detail.
In his determination to reach perfection, Selznick would go through 3 different directors while filming the picture. George Cukor, who was brought on initially to direct, lasted an impressive 3 weeks before getting fired by Selznick, even though he had invested 2 years of his life in pre-production. He was succeeded by Victor Fleming, who would remain for the majority of the picture but would take 2 weeks off after getting exhausted with the filming process, and probably dealing with Selznick, to be honest. During that time, he was replaced by Sam Wood, and while Fleming outlasted the 2 other directors who worked on the film, He would refuse to attend any of the premieres of the movies after falling out with Selznick. By the time the picture hit the screens worldwide, Fleming had the majority of days of filming with 93 days in total, followed by Wood, who had 24 days, and finally Cooker, who directed 18 days. This movie was Frankenstein's monster, and Selznick was definitely Frankenstein. Selznick's obsession in reaching perfection had cost him countless hours, huge amounts of money, 2 directors, and an unimaginable amount of stress. And this was only doubled when it came time to finding his perfect lead actors. Casting the character of Rhett Butler was not exactly a straightforward process, but it was relatively easy. There was a unanimous opinion amongst everyone who read the book about the perfect actor to play the ridiculously charming playboy with a heart of gold. And that actor was Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood. And that's easy enough, just hire him and call it a day. David Selznick was surely owed a break by now, but he wouldn't be getting it anytime soon, since Gable was not interested in the role, not even one bit. While the book was extremely popular, Gable thought of it as a woman's picture, and he was at the heights of his career at the time, so it stands to reason that he would be reluctant to take a role where he would be essentially a supporting character. Some sources quote him saying, "Why would I want to be in a movie where I'm only there half of the time?" But David Selznick was determined to get his perfect Rhett Butler, and that was Clark Gable, and he did. Stories differ on the exact method he used to persuade the reluctant Gable, but they all seem to agree on the fact that Selznick and his father-in-law, who was MGM's chief of production at the time, helped out Gable with obtaining a divorce from his then-wife Rhea Langham, so he can be married to his then-mistress Carol Lombard. Some say Rhea was paid $500,000 in order to divorce Gable, while others say that Gable only took the role so he can use his salary to sue his wife for divorce.
The people of the United States, if I can make a pompous statement, chose Clark Gable. And they decided, all the columnists, they'd discuss it on the radio, it'd be in the newspapers. They chose Clark Gable. There just wasn't anybody else who could play Rhett Butler. And that was that. Clark Gable was born to play Rhett Butler. He was Rhett Butler all of his life.
He felt that he was not Rhett Butler. Everybody that read the book, the first thing you say is that that's Clark Gable. But he could not feel this at all.
Clark Gable, he was trying to get a divorce from his wife Rhea, and she was adamant she just wasn't going to have it. And Clark was desperately in love with Carol Lombard, and so the only way he would ever say yes was through the divinations of Mr. L.B. Mayer, who said to his wife, "If you will divorce Clark, we will give you $500,000, which is more money than she'd ever heard of in her life, provided you get Clark to play the part." And so in order to get the $500,000, she not only agreed to the divorce, but told Clark she would give it to him only on condition that he play this role.
Clark Gable said, "What else are you going to do for me? You better make this worth my while. You want me to do this film?" He said, "Well, I better be paid handsomely, and you better throw in something else." And what else could you throw in? And my grandfather said, "I know you need a divorce from your wife. I'll even pay for the divorce."
Either way, he was going to be Rhett Butler, and while it was reported that Gable didn't like his costumes and struggled to memorize his lines, which were of course changing by the minute, he still gave a great performance, and he was indeed Rhett Butler. But notice how he didn't even bother to fake a southern accent, and in fact he refused to even read the book initially. He was there because of obligation, and it's interesting to see how well he personified the character, seemingly without even trying, and that's probably because he is simply a Rhett Butler in real life. Casting the main character of the film was not going to be as straightforward as casting Rhett Butler. Everything hinged on Scarlett O'Hara and the actress who was going to play her, and no one knew that better than David Selznick. And while every working Hollywood actress desperately wanted the role, David saw this as an opportunity to make a long-term investment for his production company. He knew that whoever got the role would likely be shot to global stardom in a matter of months, if not days, and why should he give that opportunity to anyone who was not signed to his own company? In an office memo, he wrote, "As to the casting of Gone with the Wind, I feel that new personalities are preferable. First, selfishly because of my belief that the roles of Scarlett and Rhett will make stars for us. And second, from the standpoint of illusion created by the picture itself. Well-known personalities are liable to be identified with their previous roles, whereas a new personality will be accepted provided they are sufficiently talented and properly cast, as Scarlett and Rhett. And with that began a 2-year national casting call that would cost Selznick approximately $100,000 and provide priceless advertisement for his upcoming project. The hunt of the perfect Scarlett had a reported 1,400 women showing up, often dressed in period costumes to read lines to the producer, all from aspiring actresses who had limited experience in acting to women who had zero acting experience. Predictably, the most challenging character to ever be written, at least for the time, would not be played by an unknown actress, forcing Selznick to relent and go back to Hollywood to interview approximately 33 working actresses. With every screen test, he seemed to like what he saw, but he was looking for perfection, and he definitely didn't see that. John Bonnet tested for the role.
Oh, Ashley, you're wrong. I do want to escape, too.
Jean Arthur also tested.
Oh, Ashley, I'm so tired of everything.
And Lana Turner.
I struggled for food and for money. I've weeded and hoed and picked cotton and even plowed until I can't stand it any longer.
And then there was Paulette Goddard, who managed to impress Selznick so much that he actually seriously considered her for the role.
Why, Charles Hamilton, you handsome old thing, you. Did you think it was kind of you to bring this good-looking brother of yours down here to break our poor, simple country hearts? Listen, I want to eat barbecue with you, Charles Hamilton, so don't you go flandering with any other girl, because I'm mighty jealous.
But there was one problem. She was living with another actor outside of wedlock, which was of course scandalous at the time. Selznick reportedly asked her to produce a marriage certificate between her and Charlie Chaplin before offering her the role officially. But unlike Clark Gable, she wouldn't be seduced into accepting his offer. Although, had she known how successful the picture would be, she would have probably said I do on the spot, especially considering that her and Chaplin would go on to marry eventually. But keep that in mind for later, as scandal and controversy wouldn't stand in Selznick's way when he did find the perfect Scarlett. He was willing to let go of his morals and fear of public reception for that one special actress. Meanwhile, the search for the character had gone on for 2 long years. Newspapers were running articles seemingly every day about the matter, and Hollywood was getting sick of it. The pressure mounted on Selznick to announce his pick for this highly anticipated role, and the pressure on Selznick only kept growing by every passing day. If he got this wrong, he would not only be disappointing himself, which is a big deal of itself, as from what I've read about the producer, he seems like a perfectionist, but he would be disappointing all of America and perhaps even the whole world. The Photoplay magazine actually commissioned an artist to paint a picture of what Scarlett should look like based on the description that Mitchel provided in her book. So yeah, people were highly invested, which in turn meant that the casting choice was so highly anticipated and people were so invested in it that when a newspaper article was published in June 24 claiming that the actress Norma Shearer has been offered the role and accepted it, all hell broke loose. There was public outrage, and Selznick International received thousands of letters of fans of the novel threatening to boycott the whole picture if Norma didn't step down, all the while suggesting their ideal cast for the role of Scarlett O'Hara. In one of my favorite letters, one fan wrote, "Dear Mr. Selznick, of all the stupid choices for parts, yours of Norma Shearer for Scarlett takes the cake. I have read Gone with the Wind 5 times, and I'll be darned if Miss Shearer fits the picture whatsoever. I for one will stay blocks away from the picture when it plays San Francisco under the present setup, and from what I've heard there are hundreds of others who share my opinion. You have 4 girls in Hollywood who could and would take the part very well. They are Katharine Hepburn, Margaret Sullivan, Miriam Hopkins, and Paulette Goddard. If Norma Shearer accepts the role of Scarlett, she's going to do herself more harm than good, and she will be gone with the wind." I really like this guy. If you are giving Norma the break because it's in your means of showing your gratitude for some specific reason, for God's sake, show it in some other way before such a fine person and a lovely actress as Miss Shearer loses all it has taken years to build. Sincerely, Oliver. Dear Mr. Selznick, this is the first time I have ever taken the trouble to write about the casting of any picture, but when I read that Norma Shearer was going to play Scarlett O'Hara, my blood boiled. Then, when I read this morning that she wanted the story changed to suit her, I could bear it no longer. We don't want Norma Shearer, we want Scarlett. Sincerely, Harriet Davis. P.S. I'd 1,000 times rather see Carole Lombard as Scarlett than Norma Shearer. My dear Mr. Selznick, imagine Norma Shearer as Scarlett. I'm actually laughing. LOL. I didn't say LOL, but it really fits. And not with you, but at you. What's the matter with Eleanor Roosevelt being signed for the part? Or May Robson, Pasty Kelly, Baby Snooks? Just what are we to expect of this production now? Well, at last I can be assured for saving 50 cents and spending one night at home when this picture is released. Yours in disgust and laughter, Roger Templeton, San Francisco. I really like Roger. He's kind of passive-aggressive, but I'm here for it. As you can probably tell, fans were not happy of this rumored casting, which eventually led to both Selznick and Norma herself to publicly announce that she would not be taking the role. The New York Times wrote, Norma Shearer today announced her withdrawal from the role of Scarlett O'Hara in Margret Mitchel's Gone with the Wind, which David O. Selznick is to make into a motion picture, attributing her decision to fan mail in which a substantial number of correspondents voiced their opinion that she would be unsuited for the role. Ms. Shearer made her decision known through MGM publicity department, and the fans' passionate opinions would be also known when David would go on to make his final choice, a relatively unknown British actress by the name of Vivien Leigh. And all I can say here is, thank God Twitter wasn't invented in 1930s, or else Selznick would have probably been cancelled. Aged 25 years with extensive stage experience but less than 10 films to her name by the time she was announced to be the final choice of this extremely desired role, Vivien's casting caused a lot of backlash. As you can imagine, the press went crazy, from newspapers outright rejecting her to others who called her casting as anticlimactic. Hedda Hopper, an American actress and gossip columnist, expressed her unenthusiasm at the news of the casting. For a more dramatic effect, she even included a letter written to her by a woman who was equally, if not more, outraged than her. But of course, we justify ourselves by saying, after all, Helen Hayes played Queen Victoria. And why not? Helen Hayes is our finest actress, with years of experience behind her, just as Victoria was England's finest queen. You see, we gave her the best we had. But to compare that with an actress whom we've only seen as a heavy in Yank in Oxford is a little ludicrous. I'm a little late reporting this, but Mr. Selznick was 2 years deciding on his Scarlett, and out of millions of American women couldn't find one to suit him, which would seem to cast a reflection on every girl born here. But here's one of the many letters I've received in protest, and I think she clarifies it much better than I ever could. Here it is. One can hardly believe that a producer who intends to pour millions into a picture could possibly make such a colossal mistake. Scarlett O'Hara is Southern, old Southern, with traditions and inborn instincts of the South. How in the name of common sense can an English actress possibly understand Scarlett? Now, to say that these articles were exaggerated or uncalled for would be unfair. This was a character that, as we've already seen, people loved and adored, and Selznick had obviously broadcasted this casting process for Scarlett as a means of gaining publicity for his upcoming project, and it worked, perhaps even too well, as now almost everyone had a different vision of what Scarlett should look like, and most importantly, what she should sound like, and none of these visions seemed to reflect Vivien Leigh. The major issue had to be that, other than her not being American of course, is how is she going to manage to do not just an American accent, but a Southern one at that. And that was a valid concern, as Vivien Leigh was extremely British.
And what's to happen after the vacation if he doesn't want to marry me? He's talked of nothing else for years. It was his idea. I never urged him. I was quite happy with him just as it was. Tell me, Your Excellency. But please tell me the truth. Did Charles tell you about me?
But all of these worries and concerns seemed to dissipate when pictures of Leigh were strategically released by Selznick International, depicting her in period costumes as the beautiful Scarlett O'Hara. And that is because Vivien Leigh embodied the character to a T, In the next chapter of this video, I will discuss how closely the actress's life and personality reflected that of the fictional character. And just like it was seemingly easy for Clark Gable to embody Rhett Butler, Vivien Leigh easily brought Scarlett O'Hara to life in her performance. But just how exactly did this unknown British actress manage to snatch the most desired role in Hollywood, a role which has been out of grasp for Hollywood's most accomplished actresses, such as Carole Lombard and Katharine Hepburn? The story goes that while the search for Scarlett was going nowhere, Selznick decided to go ahead and film the scene in which Atlanta burns, while using stand-ins for his main character. And this turned into a sort of event, an event which Selznick had invited 200 of his closest friends and co-workers to watch. And while the fake buildings were set on fire and the flames were rising to extreme heights, Selznick's brother appeared, accompanied with a beautiful young woman. David's brother, Myron Selznick, was a talent agent who was managing British actor Laurence Olivier, and the lady accompanying him, of course, was Vivien Leigh. Now, whether this event was arranged by Leigh herself, who was during that time living with Laurence Olivier, despite both him and her still being married to other people, or it was initiated by Myron Selznick himself, will be discussed in Leigh's own chapter.
Myron is supposed to have taken Vivien, without David knowing a word about this, to the set, and he is supposed to have said something like, "Hello, genius, here's your Scarlett." It turned out to be one of the great casting coups of all time.
He shot scenes of the burning of Atlanta, and that night his brother had who was an agent, Myron Selznick, had a new client who had just flown out from New York to visit her fiancé, Laurence Olivier, and he fastened a firm grip on Vivien Leigh at dinner, and he said, "My brother is shooting a fire sequence. I think you'd be interested in seeing it." And dragged her out to the set at about 11 o'clock at night, and just as David Selznick is saying action and they're lighting torches to the whole city of Atlanta with this fantastic spectacle, his brother materializes and by the flickering firelight presents her to David Selznick, and David Selznick took one look at her and he knew.
The scene was at its height when Myron Selznick walked in, holding by the hand a very, very beautiful girl, and she came in with Myron, who brought her up to Mr. Selznick, who was standing and watching this whole scene, and said, "David, I want you to meet your Scarlett O'Hara." And I tell you, she was the embodiment of Scarlett O'Hara. No one who saw her could think anything else. Mr. Selznick just flipped. He said to me, "She is everything I dreamed of."
David Selznick had finally found his perfect Rhett and his perfect Scarlett, but just because they were perfect for the role doesn't mean that they were perfect for each other. During filming, rumors spread about the two actors and their inability to tolerate each other. Whether those rumors were true or not, it's hard to decide. But one thing was known, and that is that the kisses that captivated audiences worldwide might have been a little gross.
Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable were very incompatible. Gable was always fighting for his life against this spirited girl. He felt that it was a woman's picture. It was Scarlett O'Hara's picture, and he says, "I'm a big star. I don't want to play second fiddle to some dame." I don't know if I should say this, but you know, Clark Gable had false teeth, and she didn't like to kiss him.
In an interview with The Guardian, Leigh would make a comment saying, "Kissing Clark Gable in Gone with the Wind was not that exciting. His dentures smelled something awful." The King of Hollywood had developed a serious gum infection in 1933, which eventually led to his teeth being removed, and he subsequently had to be fitted with oral dentures. But he unfortunately was left with what seemed to be a permanent case of bad breath as a result. But I have to say that his teeth looked amazing. This might be the first version of a Hollywood smile that I've ever seen on screen. And while this story is silly, it just made me realize how good of an actress Vivien was. She seemingly didn't really enjoy her time with Gable, and the two butted heads constantly, and she definitely did enjoy kissing him, but you would be hard-pressed to see that on the screen. Sure, there are scenes where she can't stand him, but in the other ones where she is supposed to be seduced by him, it's very believable. And the same goes for Clark Gable. Their chemistry, at least on screen, was unmatched. With the sets built, the script written and rewritten several times, and the remaining characters cast and ready, filming began and the pressure continued, and perhaps no one felt that pressure more than Vivien Leigh, who had faced doubts since the moment she was announced. This was the role of a lifetime, and she was determined to meet every expectation Selznick and the audience had. She endured long filming hours in heavy period costumes that were mostly filmed in the scorching sun of the summer, made worse by the huge Technicolor cameras, which no doubtedly added to the heat and made filming even worse. Furthermore, she kept up with the screen tests, which Selznick insisted on doing for every scene and every outfit, in his continuous quest for perfection. She memorized the ever-changing lines and delivered them with a perfect southern accent every time. Her co-stars would remark on how exhausting filming was for her and for them, and she coped with the stress of everything happening by chain-smoking on set, all while she practically carried the whole picture on her slim shoulders. By the time principal photography had wrapped, Leigh would appear on screen for a total of 2 hours, 23 minutes and 32 seconds. The success of the movie, and it was very successful, was a direct reflection of Leigh's outstanding performance. On December 15, 1939, the highly anticipated picture would premiere in Atlanta to thousands of crowds. The movie would receive excellent reviews and would go on to sell an outstanding $20 million in the first 5 months of its release. Similar to its novel, it would be translated into 25 different languages and remains the highest-selling movie of all time, until this day. In an interview with Selznick done after the film was released, he would be asked about his feelings towards the movie which has consumed so much of his life. His response would be, "At noon I think it's divine, at midnight I think it's lousy, sometimes I think it's the greatest picture ever made, but if it's only a great picture I'll be satisfied." The movie would go on to receive 8 Oscars in total, and Vivien Leigh would go from a relatively unknown British actress to being nominated for Best Leading Actress. She would win, establishing her performance as the best of that year.
1939 by an actress, Vivien Leigh in Gone with the Wind.
Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive me if my words are inadequate in thanking you for your very great kindness. If I were to mention all those who have shown me such wonderful generosity through Gone with the Wind, I should have to entertain you with an oration as long as Gone with the Wind itself. So, if I may, I should like to devote my thanks on this occasion to that composite figure of energy, courage, and very great kindness, in whom all points of Gone with the Wind meet, Mr. David Selznick.
The year's greatest picture.
And if you consider a poll done by Entertainment Weekly in 2018, which had fans vote for their all-time Best Actress winner, poll which Leigh won, then Vivien Leigh's performance in Gone with the Wind is the best until this day. Chapter 2: Scarlett O'Hara, a complex character. The character of Scarlett holds up until this day, as evident by the Entertainment Weekly poll I had mentioned earlier. In the chapter dedicated to Margret Mitchel, I will be discussing how she drew inspiration from real-life events and characters, which effectively added a touch of reality to nearly all of her fictional characters and the world in which they live in, which in turn allowed her to create both timeless characters and a timeless story. And Scarlett has to be the finest of Mitchel's creations. She starts off the film and the novel as a spoiled, self-centered, and arrogant child who is used to getting everything handed to her, and in the rare cases in which that doesn't happen, she has no problem with stepping on people to get it. Her selfish actions often lead to people around her getting hurt. Her childish personality is evident in her extremely childish thinking and decisions. She has a crush on Ashley even though she doesn't really take the time to get to know him. Instead, she obsesses over the image of him which she has in her head, and this is enough for her to constantly make attempts at getting with him, disregarding the feelings of her friend Melanie. Moreover, this behavior continues continues even when him and Melanie get married and have a child together. For better or worse, Scarlett is always single-minded in nearly all of her actions. Her marriages, and yes, she has plenty of them, are always rash and have an ulterior motive. Not a single one of them is for love. In fact, she dislikes all three of her husbands. Her first marriage to the naive and innocent Charles, who happens to be Melanie's brother, occurs after she confesses her feelings to Ashley, who doesn't exactly flat out reject her, but he does go on to marry Melanie. He states that him and Scarlett are too different, and he essentially calls her not marriage material. Or at least that's how it came off to me.
I love you.
Scarlett,
I love you, I do.
how can I make you understand? You're so young and unthinking, you don't know what marriage means. She's like me, Scarlett. She's part of my blood, and we understand each other.
But you love me.
And in response, as if to prove him wrong, and possibly hoping to stay in his orbit, she accepts a marriage proposal from Melanie's brother. I feel like her first marriage is nothing but a temper tantrum that she throws when she doesn't get her way with Ashley. Her second marriage to her sister's fiance isn't any better. This time her motive is money, and everyone can see it except poor Frank. Instead of her character learning from her previous marriage to a man who she didn't love, nor did she even bother to mourn properly, she dives headfirst into another marriage, but this time it's so much worse. She lies to him and manipulates him in order to drive him away from her sister's hands and into hers. Her third and final marriage is again for money and, more importantly, status. Having grown accustomed to the luxurious lifestyle, she agrees to marry the filthy rich Rhett butler. Every decision she makes seems to end in her hurting the characters around her, which paints her in a really bad light. So why then do a lot of people love her? And the answer to that lies in Mitchel's great ability to write the perfect anti-hero. Scarlett is an extremely flawed character. She's downright despicable at times, but yet I can't help but cheer her on as she struggles for nearly 3 hours straight. In the midpoint of the movie, right after the intermission, we are introduced to a different Scarlett. Having gone through the horrors of war firsthand, starved and traumatized by working in the hospital, and seeing all the soldiers suffer while she is unable to do much to help them, not to mention having to deliver Melanie's baby all on her own and having Rhett essentially abandon her. This is followed almost instantly by the one tragedy that finally breaks her, the death of her mother, the one person who she had fought to get to and believed she would be safe with. And with that final blow, Scarlett changes. She is selfish, egocentrical, and cruel, don't get me wrong, but she's grown now and she is not scared anymore. Her father is grief-stricken and can't be relied on. Her sisters are stuck in the pre-war mindset, and Melanie and her baby depend on her. And it's here that she makes a promise to herself and the audience that this will not break her.
If God is my witness, they're not going to lick me. I'm going to live through this, and when it's all over, I'll never be hungry again.
And in that moment, how can you not root for her? We're designed by nature to root for the underdog, the victim, the helpless, and Mitchel does a good job of, well, for lack of a better word, victimizing Scarlett by her circumstances. Her character is broken down to nothing, she loses everything, and that switch in your head that goes off whenever you see someone struggling is activated, and suddenly Scarlett might not be so bad after all. Sure, she is still cruel, self-absorbed, but she's also just trying to survive. Moreover, her scheming and unethical business habits allow for the survival of everyone around her and for her family's land to thrive again. Therefore, while you definitely don't approve of her actions, you might find yourself understanding them, and maybe even justify them. Furthermore, the movie almost punishes Scarlett for all of her bad decisions throughout the story. She experiences an unrealistic amount of death. Her mother dies, this is followed by the death of her father. She suffers a miscarriage, and then her only daughter has an accident and dies as well. And finally, when she finally accepts Rhett's love for her, her marriage with him essentially dies as well. This happens because Mitchel is aware that her main character is flawed and unlikable, and she embraces it. The actions of Scarlett are hardly ever painted in a way which asks for your compassion, but the sheer determination of this flawed character and her will to survive demands it of its readers. And it makes total sense. I doubt anyone would want to follow the story of the extremely nice and selfless Melanie for 4 hours straight. And that's because the story would be ethical, sure, but it also would be extremely boring. And of course it helps that Scarlett is drop-dead gorgeous and extremely charming, and Vivien Leigh lends a charm to the character that I can't imagine anyone else being able to achieve. She nails the comedic moments as well as the horrible ones. Her facial expressions alone are a masterclass in acting. She conveys sadness, confusion, happiness, and regret effortlessly. Even when she isn't talking, her face is always doing something, and it's never over the top or exaggerated as it's common for that era of acting. The costumes that Scarlett wears help in conveying her story as well. In the beginning of the movie, she appears in bright, colorful, and fluffy gowns that help convey an image of a naive, spoiled, rich child whose only problem in life is finding love. As she goes through the war, the beautiful and intricate dresses are reduced to a single dress, which Scarlett spends nearly all of that period in, and in a direct reflection of her character, the dress becomes worn out, beaten, covered in dirt, and unrecognizable. And it's in this dress that she makes the vow to never let the world get the better of her ever again, no matter the consequences. When Scarlett goes to visit Rhett in hopes of deceiving him into lending her money, she wears the over-the-top famous green curtain dress, fashioned expertly by her mammy, and while she does look the part of her old self, her hands betray her. The innocence, if you can even call it that in the case of Scarlett, is gone, and the war has forever changed her, arguably for the worst. With money comes the return of the beautiful fashionable dresses, intricate hairstyles, and exquisite hats. And in this period of her life, Scarlett's dresses get better with every scene as her money and status grow. First as a result of marrying Frank, and later after marrying Rhett. And then there is the red dress. It has to be my favorite of all of Scarlett's dresses, and it's interesting that this dress was picked for her by Rhett after he discovers that she still loves Ashley, or at least she thinks that she still loves Ashley. This dress is bright red and shows off all of her curves. It draws attention to her. I mean, you can't help but stare at her. I feel like this dress reflects how Rhett sees her now. While Scarlett does wear red throughout the movie, it's always covered and presented in a socially acceptable way for the times. But this Rhett is bright, revealing, and it's exposing. Rhett has finally come to terms that she will never love him the same way that she loves Ashley, and the truth is exposed to him and to everyone else around them, and in turn he seeks to expose her innocence. He dresses her in the flashiest dress she owns and sends her off to a party full of their friends alone. Now maybe I'm reading too much into this and the dress was just picked by him because hey, she looks pretty in it, but I guess I'll never know. Chapter 3. Vivien Leigh as Scarlett O'Hara.
She had very beautiful manners and a very feminine way. She was also, I think, capricious and a bit perverse, which made her interesting, of course. She was a rather complex person and very like Scarlett.
Vivien's whole life was willful, regardless of consequences, just as Scarlett's was.
The uncanny parallels between the lives of Vivien and Scarlett are honestly just fascinating. If anyone was to tell me that Scarlett is a fictional character inspired by the real-life personality of Vivien Leigh, I would probably believe them. Leigh is a British actress born in 1913. She was an only child born to a wealthy family. She's described by people who knew her in her childhood as headstrong, confident, and maybe even slightly spoiled. Fellow actress and friend Maureen O'Sullivan described her in an interview as a strikingly beautiful and confident girl.
She was always a beautiful little girl. I remember we used to do silly things in school, like voting for the most popular or the most pretty or the most talented or the most likely to be outstanding in the world. And I remember Vivien Leigh got the vote. Well, Vivien always wanted to be an actress. She was single-minded. She was the only girl in the school to take ballet, for instance. She took it alone. The only one. Well, it was rather brave of her.
At age 19, Vivien would meet a handsome lawyer named Herbert Lee Holman while at a picnic with her family. Sources recount the young actress being instantly intrigued with him. However, when she inquired about him, she found him to be already engaged. But in a move that is straight out of Scarlett O'Hara's Book of Moves, she announced to her fans that that really didn't matter and that she was going to make him her husband instead. And that she did. By 1932, the couple were married. Vivien was ahead of her time in many ways, and especially when it came to being a stay-at-home mom. When the newly married couple were blessed with their daughter Susan, Vivien hired a nanny to take care of her, and she used her free time instead to focus on building her career as a stage actress.
And she simply entered in her diary, had a baby. not even had a daughter, or had a daughter called Suzanne, but had a baby.
This lack of natural mothering instincts was a characteristic found both in Vivien, the actress, and Scarlett, the character. Both had a young daughter, which they seem not to prioritize, and I'm in no way saying that they didn't love their child, of course not. But it's just uncanny how both women would end up betrayed in the same manner, whether that's by the media or by Mitchel's writing. Leigh would eventually give up custody of her child, who would be raised by her husband and her mother, while Scarlett is almost never seen on screen being affectionate to her daughter. Nearly all of Bonnie's scenes, except for one, is shown with Rhett instead, where he is depicted as being extremely loving and affectionate to her. But back to Vivien's career. Her beautiful features and personality got her the role in her debut theatre play, A Mask of Virtue, a role which she landed at the young age of 19. Her performance received favorable reviews, with headlines referring to her as a promising young actress, and an actress who won fame at 19, Miss Vivien Leigh on her triumph. And finally, new stage star debuted sparkling wits in A Mask of Virtue. Her theatre career would eventually lead her to attend a Romeo and Juliet play in London, headlined by actor Laurence Olivier. Leigh found herself once again enchanted by Laurence, and by the time that play ended, she turned to her friend and said, "That's the man I'm going to marry," to which her friend reminded her that she was in fact already married, and also so was Olivier. But in another personification of her future role as Scarlett O'Hara, Vivien would visit Laurence in his dressing room and reportedly plant a kiss on the back of his neck before leaving, which of course was very scandalous, especially when you consider the fact that Leigh had a husband and a daughter at home, and worse, that Laurence had a pregnant wife and an infant son. But headstrong and unwilling to let a small technicality such as marriage, or two marriages, stand in her way, Leigh would arrange for herself to attend a vacation with Laurence and his wife Jill Esmond, which must have been really awkward, to be honest, and I imagine Jill, unlike Melanie, knew exactly what was going on. In fact, their whole friend circle knew that Leigh and Olivier were deeply in love with each other, and it's reported that their chemistry was so strong that their whole friend group rooted for them to just end up together, which has to be devastating for the two spouses involved. Vivien was eager to perform on stage with her then lover, and when the opportunity came in the form of a Hamlet play, she jumped at the chance. After the play had dropped, the two moved in together into a townhouse while still being married to their respective spouses, which again, this was the 1930s and this was all too shocking. Around this time, Olivier's career started to take off and he flew to Hollywood to film Wuthering Heights. While Leigh was alone in London, casting calls were announced for the movie adaptation of Gone with the Wind. Having read the book, Vivien was interested in the character of Scarlett O'Hara, but so was every other actress in the world. Sources recount Vivien's determination in acquiring the role, a determination which often got her where she needed to go, and this time was no different. She traveled to Hollywood to see her then partner Olivier and got in touch with his agent, which was none other than Myron Selznick, David Selznick's brother, and the two arranged for her to meet the producer while he was filming The Burning of Atlanta. Some sources say that she even showed up dressed in period costume, and of course she got the role. Her unwavering belief in herself would get her her first Oscar nomination and subsequent win, in the process solidifying her career as an accomplished actress. By 1940, both Olivier and Leigh were divorced and were now married to each other. They were the it couple of their time. They toured the world performing plays together, and in 1943, Leigh would travel in a tour of North Africa as part of the war effort. It's there where she would catch the respiratory illness of tuberculosis. In 1945, Leigh was recovered enough and she was offered the role of Cleopatra in the film production of Caesar and Cleopatra. During filming, the actress discovered that she was pregnant, but sadly, while performing a physically demanding scene, she would slip, fall, and this would result in her first miscarriage. This event would trigger a mental breakdown in Leigh, with those knowing her describing this period of her life as being extremely dark, covered in depression, and resulting in sometimes unconsolable and hysterical fits. Her husband started recognizing a pattern in his wife's behavior, periods of hyperactivity and manic behavior which were followed by a crippling depression, a description which led a lot of people to believe that Leigh was in fact dealing with bipolar disorder. And while bipolar episodes can be managed in this day and age, in the 1940s, mental disorders as a whole were extremely under-researched. And as a result of this ignorance, treatment consisted mainly of shock therapy, which Leigh received several cycles of. Leigh would continue working while struggling with her mental health, and while she made several pictures, the reception of them was rather poor. While her career seemed to slow down, Lawrence's was on the rise. In 1947, he was knighted and Leigh became known as Lady Olivier. In 1948, the couple would head on a tour of Australia, in an effort to raise money for the British theatre, and it's there where things reportedly started to fall apart. The tour was an extensive one which lasted for 6 months, during which the two actors would have continuous arguments, sometimes even ending in physical violence, which they had to sweep under the carpet while they performed lovingly at stage together. Things were only made worse when Vivien met Australian actor Peter Flynch, who she would reportedly go on to have a romantic relationship with while still being married to Olivier. Chapter 4. Along Came a Streetcar Named Desire. It's fitting that the two Oscars Vivien would go on to win would be for the two roles which most accurately reflected the reality of her life at the time. Scarlett O'Hara embodied a young Vivien Leigh. She was stunning, confident, and sometimes even cruel. She was a young woman fixated on love and her goals, and much like Scarlett, she managed to achieve nearly every single one of them. And while she suffered from tragedies, she coped with them and came out even stronger. Her second Oscar would come in 1951 for her role as Blanche Dubois in a movie adaptation of the successful and controversial play A Streetcar Named Desire. Vivien had performed the role on stage for the better part of a year, and this role specifically took a great toll on her already deteriorating mental health. The play and the movie required her to play a character based in delusion and is quite literally on the verge of a mental breakdown. Blanche is a woman who is extremely sensitive and fragile. She's obviously struggling with her mental health, and she has instances of what seems to be flashbacks throughout the movie, which were brought on by the harsh life that she has lived, and specifically the death of her husband, which she believes to be her fault. Leigh would channel her own struggles with her mental health into the character of Blanche, and the pressure was made even worse when she was cast to act within a group of actors who all had a similar acting style, known as method acting. This style of acting was new and was on the rise, and it resembles how actors nowadays act. It was understated and drew inspiration from the actor's own life and experiences. But Leigh was a trained stage actress. Her performances are completely different, and in this movie it actually fits perfectly for her character. Leigh's theatrical performance lends itself perfectly to the delusions of Blanche, while Brandon's method acting is all based on reality, much like his character Stanley and his view of his life. And the back and forth between these two actors is amazing to watch. Their characters were written to be complete opposites and almost living in different worlds, and that translates to the screen amazingly. Stanley's way of talking and even movement throughout the movie is very realistic, while Blanche's dialogue and movement is otherworldly.
Oh, hi. Hey, where's the woman?
It's mine too. It's hard to stay looking fresh in hot weather when I haven't washed or even powdered. Here.
Especially when you've been exercising hard like bowling. Well, you're the teacher, aren't you?
This performance would earn Leigh her second Oscar win, but it's also the role that is believed to drive her over the edge. Vivien would make a comment in the Los Angeles Times saying, "I had 9 months in the theater as Blanche Dubois. She now has command over me." The way the roles of Scarlett O'Hara and Blanche Dubois reflected so closely Vivien's life at the time she performed the characters never fails to amaze me. In Gone with the Wind, life imitated art, and in A Streetcar Named Desire, sadly, art imitated life. In 1953, Leigh would be cast in a movie called Elephant Walk with her then reported lover, Peter Flynch. But her mental health was at an all-time low, and she had what is referred to as a mental breakdown. She and Flynch were flown back to Hollywood, and she was replaced by Elizabeth Taylor. In between periods where her mental health allowed her, Leigh continued to work while her marriage continued to fall apart. In 1960, Leigh and Olivier officially divorced, ending an epic romance that had captivated the hearts of many people. In 1967, Leigh, aged 53, would pass away after struggling with TB in her London flat. She reportedly had spent the day arranging flowers before collapsing suddenly. Upon her death, every theatre in London dimmed their lights for 1 hour in her memory, and the world will still remember her 80 years later. She remains a fashion icon and a beloved star until this day, and I'm sure for decades to come. Chapter 5. Margret Mitchel, the other woman behind the greatest role of all time. The story of Margret Mitchel, who is the author of what is regarded as the most successful novel to ever be published, is almost as fascinating as her main character, Scarlett O'Hara. Perhaps that's because the two share a lot of similarities. Born in 1900, Margret Mitchel was a revolutionary, and that's not just because she managed to write a literary masterpiece that remains popular even after 9 decades since it first hit shelves of bookstores worldwide. In fact, her novel was so popular that it reached more than 30 million readers worldwide, who enjoyed it in a variety of languages and experienced something that they were never a part of American history. This one novel broke the boundaries of culture and became a widespread phenomenon. It didn't just cross cultures, it crossed centuries. 2014, a national poll revealed it to be the most popular book amongst American readers, coming only second to the good book itself, the Holy Bible. All of these accomplishments are extremely impressive, but it gets even more impressive when you consider the fact that Margret was not a published author at the time of writing Gone with the Wind. In fact, you can argue that she wasn't an author at all. Sure, she had 4 years of journalism experience, writing at the Atlanta Journal, and she excelled at her job, so much so that she made a successful career out of it. And she also had a history of writing short stories since she was a child, with her active imagination leading her into a world full of romance, action, horror, and comedy. But that still doesn't make her a novelist. She had never struggled with deadlines while writing thousands of words per day, which can take you anywhere from a few minutes to hours to come up with, depending on what the words are, of course, all in an effort to publish that one book that would launch her career into the success she always dreamed of. No, for Margret, Gone with the Wind was almost an afterthought, a happy coincidence that would have an impression on generations to come. So then, if Margret wasn't a struggling or even an aspiring novelist, then what was she? Well, she was an imaginative and precocious writer who was forced to leave a career she enjoyed as a journalist after an ankle injury which confined her to her small apartment. Bored and struggling with depression, she threw herself into the world of books. This was her way of escaping a reality which she wasn't happy with, which kinda makes sense. This is kind of her version of Netflix. Her husband would come home from work carrying all the books that he can find from their local library day after day until one day he just got fed up with carrying all the books. Those things are heavy and maybe he had a bad back. So in a mixture of jest and frustration, he said to his wife, "For God's sakes, Peggy, can't you write a book instead of reading thousands of them?" And with that, a 10-year journey would begin, ending with the production of a massive manuscript that would eventually become the Gone with the Wind novel. And 4 years later, the second most expensive movie production at the time, and the highest grossing film until this day. And by now you probably are wondering, how did this first-time accidental bestseller of her generation was able to write a complex character who touched the lives of millions of people across the years and across languages, and continued to do so decade after decade after decade? And the answer to that is simple. Margret had what most successful authors have: inspiration. And she didn't have to search far for that inspiration. Her own life was plenty interesting. The popular saying of "not like other girls" is a cliche nowadays, but Margret Mitchel was really not like the other girls in the 1900s. From her early childhood, she stood out, both in her way of thinking as well as her style of dress. After suffering an accident in which a young Margret's dress caught fire while playing next to a fireplace, her mother would decide to dress her daughter in trousers, a style which Margret grew to love and embrace all the way through her adult life. And given how this is what the ideal woman was meant to look like at the time, it's fair to say that Margret stood out, much like her main protagonist, Scarlett, does. And the similarities wouldn't end there. Both women had an Irish ancestry, both were Southerners with rich families, both had a traumatic history with horses, and of course, they were both charming young ladies with interesting love lives. Margret's outgoing personality, charming sense of humor, and self-confidence were extremely attractive to almost everyone around her, and the men were not immune to her charm. Margret described herself as an unscrupulous flirt. Not sure what that means. And it's reported that she had received a total of 5 engagement offers as a result, although Margret would like you to know that she neither lied nor misled any of those gentlemen. Much like Scarlett, Margret was the object of affection of the majority of the men she met. She was a striking beauty with green eyes and a personality to die for, or at least proposed to, a fact which was not lost on anyone who knew her. A local gossip columnist described Mitchel's love life in a 1922 column by saying, "She has in her brief life perhaps had more men really, truly dead in love with her, more honest-to-goodness suitors than almost any other girl in Atlanta." The same year this article was written, Margret would go on to meet her future husband and her other future husband. Shortly after graduating college, Vivien Kennard, nicknamed Rhett, was a handsome and reckless man, and he was Mitchel's first husband. The marriage was disastrous, and I can't help but think that this was the main inspiration for Scarlett's many disastrous weddings. Throughout the short 2 years in which the couple were married, Margret became miserable as her husband refused to work, forcing the two of them to move back into her father's house, while Vivien abused her both mentally and physically. She was forced to provide for both of them, which is how she acquired her job as a journalist, a job which she had zero experience in, but she charmed her way into. The 2-year ordeal would come to an end in 1924 with the annulment of the marriage, which freed Margret to marry the other man she had been seeing prior to her marriage to Rhett, John Marsh, who also happens to be a close friend of Margaret's first husband and was in fact the best man at their wedding. And this time Margret would be happy. They adored each other and would have a daughter together. They remained married until their death, and sources report that he was her #1 supporter. He read each chapter of Gone with the Wind as she wrote it, bought her a state-of-the-art typewriter, and would later manage the massive empire that Gone with the Wind would eventually become. After her untimely death, John would burn the first manuscript of the novel, as per Margaret's request, but he would keep a few chapters safe in a vault in case anyone would question his wife of being the true author of Gone with the Wind. Margret did not only draw inspiration from the happy moments of her life, but she also drew inspiration from the tragic ones. In both the novel and the movie, Scarlett would be faced with many traumatic deaths, but perhaps one of the most tragic ones was the death of her mother. It signaled a shift from Scarlett's innocent young years into the determined and ruthless woman that she would eventually become. This one single event plays a huge role in the development of her character. It's the death of her innocence. When Scarlett is faced with the war coming to her doorsteps and the weight of the world on her shoulders, as she nurses dying soldiers and delivers Melanie's baby all by herself, she cries for her mother.
Don't you know it's dangerous jousting Mrs. Wilkes over miles of open country?
I want my mother. I want to go home to Sarah. I'll kill you if you try to stop me. I will.
All right.
She rushes through an active war zone so she can go back home in hopes of embracing her mother. In her arms, she is sure she will find comfort and the solution to all of her problems. It's the last remaining bit of hope that Scarlett has, but Scarlett would get there too late. When she finally arrives back to the destruction that is Tara, she finds out that her mother has passed away. She had never gotten the chance to say goodbye, and this moment never fails to break my heart, and is one of the main reasons why I personally sympathize with Scarlett's character, who is selfish, spoiled, and at times annoying. But she's human too. All her money, charm, and beauty wouldn't protect her from something that we all experience at some point of our lives: the death of a loved one. The tragic sentiment of this moment is everything. It's at the heart of Scarlett's character for me, and it all came straight out of Mitchel's real life. When Mitchel's own mother passed away after contracting influenza, which was an epidemic at the time, she would not be there by her side. Margret was away at college, and despite rushing to reach her mom by catching the first train she can, similar to Scarlett, despite her best efforts, she would get there too late. Margret would arrive one day after her mother's passing. Knowing this makes the scene even more sad for me, but it also makes it mean more. It's sad when a fictional character goes through that, but it's heartbreaking when it's Margret who actually experienced it. And I kinda think that's why Scarlett works so well as a character. By injecting so much of herself, her real life, the happy moments as well as the sad ones, Margret would succeed in painting a three-dimensional character that the audience can both adore and despise at the same time. And that's not an easy thing to do. By making her essentially human, she would break away from the widespread image of the stereotypical 1930s woman, or at least the image which was dominating both literature and film. And in turn, the world responded with universal understanding. It didn't matter that the book was being published in countries that didn't even speak English, or countries like mine where the Civil War was a foreign idea that I still don't fully understand to this day. That never stopped the book or the movie from being successful, because the war, language, or culture wasn't the main character. Scarlett was, and her story of survival was enough to capture the hearts of millions. Now, the history of Margret Mitchel goes way deeper than that. The awards she won, her death, and reaction to fame is all really fascinating, but I don't have the time to go through all of those details, so I'm sorry if I missed any important details in this chapter. I tried to include the best parts of her life and the parts that really spoke to me. Chapter 6: Conclusion. Gone with the Wind is a movie with a complicated and even shameful history. It's riddled with highly offensive racial stereotypical depictions that honestly ruined the whole movie for me at certain points while watching. Furthermore, those issues are present from the instance it was conceived as a novel to its production and even its premiere. In researching this film, I learned about Mammy, played by the amazing actress Hattie McDaniel, and her nomination and subsequent win of an Oscar, which was extremely deserved. But then I also found out that the Oscars were segregated and she was not allowed to sit with her castmates due to her race, which not only broke my heart but made me extremely angry.
This is one of the happiest moments of my life. My heart is too full to tell you just how I feel. And may I say thank you. God bless you.
Moreover, the disrespectful treatment and depictions of characters such as Prissy, played by Butterfly McQueen, Pork, played by Oscar Polk, and Big Sam, portrayed by Everett Brown, and reducing them to a shallow character that is played for comedic effects, despite the deeply disturbing reality of real-life people who actually experience these situations. It's shocking, to say the least. And in making this video, I do not condone any of those instances. In fact, I can't imagine any person who could. When I first watched this movie with my mom, the racial aspect of the film were honestly lost on me. I was young and distracted by the pretty dresses and amazing scenes, and this is the version I reviewed today. A happy memory with my mother, watching Scarlett show up in her curtain-made dress and laughing when her and Rhett Butler bicker. I understand if anyone has strong opinions about this film, its maker and the actors who took part in it, as I do too. I can't imagine anyone watching this movie and not feeling a certain kind of way. In fact, it's hard for me to understand how no one thought better at the time of making it. But as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I truly believe that I am not in a place where I can articulate my opinions on this matter and extremely complicated history. Beyond pointing out the obvious that racism is wrong, but there are many videos which do an amazing job of examining these horrible things that the movie and the novel depict. I'll link them down below for anyone who is interested. That being said, if you have made it to the end, which I don't imagine a lot of you did, please consider subscribing to this channel. This video is really hard to research and make, but I thoroughly enjoyed rewatching the movie with my mother, and maybe stealing some of her ideas. Thank you for watching!